right. Welcome. Welcome. I think I'm going to try to get this started. Thanks, everyone, for coming. This is the second lecture in our spring Architecture Advisory Council lecture series, sponsored by the Architecture Advisory Council. This lecture happens to be, though, the sponsored lecture of the Richard Hansen Endowment. So it's kind of a special lecture. And as many of you will know, over the years, we also have a student competition that we hold with the Hansen lecture, and that competition is a paid competition. It is based on projects carried out from the 301 studio. It's the Architecture and Landscape Studio. The studio the studio is from last fall, and each studio instructor selected one project, representative project from their studio, and today we spent 2 hours, Reinier de Graaf, myself, and Jason Allreed spent 2 hours or so with the projects and then deliberating after for the prize. So the first thing I'm going to do is announce the prize. I know many of you, this isn't going to be, you didn't see the projects or you don't know what this is about, but we do this always with the Hansen lecture. And so, after careful deliberation and much debate, no, really, it was an interesting and animated discussion. We decided that in this case, we were going to award one first prize and then just a small token prize to the other 4 projects. There was something that seemed very odd about first, second, and third when you have 5 projects, right? What does that mean for 4 and 5? And also we felt that there was one project that really stood out in many ways, both in terms of the presentation, the clear conceptual direction of the project, and mostly because the project took a different stance, a different direction, and we felt that it was a brave project, that it dared to break some rules and make a statement. And that project belongs to Will Pigeon. Will, congratulations. Would you like to stand up? The only project with only one person on the team, and Will, we will be awarding you a $2,500 prize. I hope you do something wonderful with that. We're working under the assumption that you will, and that you will use that fund to, go towards your education, travel. And the other $500, it's a $3,000 prize in total. The other $500 will be divided amongst the 4 projects, so you guys can go out to dinner. Take each other to dinner. So anyway, congratulations. All right. All right, now I'm going to introduce the speaker tonight. Reinier de Graaf, long-standing partner in the office OMA. Most of you know this as an architecture firm out of the Netherlands, but Reinier is also a long-standing respected colleague of mine and a very good friend, one of the few friends I left behind when I came here from the Netherlands. So I'm especially happy that he could come and be with us tonight. Reinier is also known for his work with the think tank branch of OMA. Many of you will know this as AMO. AMO is responsible for many of the notoriously divergent and alternative architecture projects that many of you will know the office for. Reinier is also, of course, the partner who you've seen in many of the TED Talks and much of the work that comes out of that office in terms of, for instance, the Roadmap 2050 project is a product of the AMO office. What he's going to present tonight, I'm hoping, is partly that divergent work, the work of AMO, but also the work of OMA. He is an OMA partner. He happens to be the director of AMO as well. And what I've asked him to do is truly give an example of how architecture can be both a highly disciplined practice, the practice that many of you expect from your own careers, but also an exercise in thinking the future, thinking the problematics of culture and politics. And so the title of the lecture was Architecture in Quotation Marks, because it is both and the built work and the work of cultural and political critique. Reinier, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I've assembled a presentation that I hope does justice to what I suspected would be the introduction. Let me begin by reflecting on the name of our office. A name invented in the 70s, a pretty grandiose name, Metropolitan Architecture. But despite being based on any major architectural achievement at the time, it is actually a name that finds its origin in a book about what at that point in time was the metropolis in the world, hence the name of the office. But actually in current times, we find ourselves in a bit of a strange situation. I guess you could call this a realized delirious New York, but it's not in New York, it's actually in Rotterdam, which is not a metropolis, which is actually, well, fairly provincial in many ways, but nevertheless is the host of a building like this, the kind of chainsaw massacre World Trade Center that ended up on the river bank. As I said, clearly a product of globalization and a product of an office which by now is global. 5 offices straddling practically every continent. I think at the last count, 48 active projects in something like 85 countries, or the other way around. It doesn't really matter. What the most interesting fact of our office is not this sense of achievement, but it's the fact that that global reach has actually created a global demographics in the context of the office itself, to the sense that working globally has actually created a small cosmos in Rotterdam and in the other office, which really reflect, in a way, a kind of global demographics. This is our office. Well, it's part of our office. The interesting thing is that in the Netherlands, the Dutch are a minority in this office. In Hong Kong, the Chinese are a minority. In Qatar, the Emiratis are a minority. And I believe in America, the Americans are a minority, even though that might be a slightly more problematic concept or difficult concept. But it's essentially, I would say, that our work is based on the absence of a cultural majority in our office. That in a way, it's a kind of nuclear fusion, it's a kind of constant cultural clash, at which there is no prevailing consensus, at which anything is endlessly interrogated, a phenomenally, deliberately inefficient process, as you can see here. Where, in a way, through what is often a painful and lengthy journey in terms of creating ideas, where no particular, neither an ethnic majority in the office nor even a kind of layer of the hierarchy has a monopoly on an idea, where ideas, I guess, just flow, and through a lengthy critique, through a kind of process of selection, eventually the ideas that see the light of day are selected. This is our largest building to date. It is often seen as our magnum opus, the end of a long journey of projects that actually from the 1970s led up to it. But of course this building was designed meanwhile more than 10 years ago completed more than 5 years ago, and clearly there's been a life after this building in which the office has taken a particular direction. The office is no longer the product of a single brain or a single figurehead. It never was. But at least that situation is formalized in the fact that there are multiple owners, so that in a sense it is a company. And somewhat a changed role of the founder, who at one point, I will not elaborate. Sort of well-meaning advice, and an advice that is also took. This is another very important building, a building that didn't get built shortly after CCTV, a building in Dubai where we in a way rediscovered the splendor of simplicity. It's a very formally interesting building in a sense that from one side it exposed a massive presence, from another side it exposed a massive slenderness, only to reveal a massive presence again under another angle. This building was built designed somewhere in the early days of the 21st century, when you could say that architecture in a very interesting way had come full cycle, our own production not accepted. A kind of a race to make the most exceptional building, a kind of race to make the most iconic building, a kind of race of people to get noticed through the buildings, which at one point when all the buildings are icons, none of them are icons. They mutually sort of cancel each other out in a kind of sea of extravagance. And weirdly enough, something that is utterly boring becomes utterly interesting in the context when everyone is interesting. So in a way, this was an interesting insight. I guess it was also a destruction of some of our earlier insights or efforts that we had done up until then. But this building, here you see the facade. Of course, we couldn't resist urges of interest, as you can see in these Fazzarelli kind of distortions of the facade. We were very happy. We designed Dubai stamps that featured the building. Here it's an edition of an advert in a Korean newspaper where the building almost becomes a form of typography. And anyway, a kind of branded concept, pure, straight, predictable, honest, and fair. Anyway, the building, as I said, wasn't built, but it's had a profound effect on everything we've done since. This is the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, designed shortly after. As you can see, the advice of the 90-degree angle only is followed very, very diligently. This is the Rotterdam building, the building I showed earlier, 90 degrees only. This is the Qatar headquarters for the Qatar Foundation, 90 degrees only. A cube with a complex interior. This is another building in Rotterdam, a cube with a complex interior. This is a residential building in England, a cube with a complex interior, 90 degrees only. This is the new town hall in Rotterdam, 90 degrees only. The extension to Cornell University, 90 degrees only, etc., 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 etc. The reason for this return to a kind of formal simplicity of the exterior is partially driven by a need to stand out, maybe, but more driven by the fact that there is increasingly an interest in what goes on in the buildings, in a kind of an analysis of a post-occupancy situation well before we designed the building. This is the interior of Cornell. This is a kind of a study of a working landscape shop. This is another interior. This is, again, another interior of a building. It's the interior of a fashion brand where actually jeans are produced, as is this one. And this is the headquarters of a recently completed building in the Netherlands for G-Star denim. 90 degrees only still. What is interesting about this particular building is not necessarily the building, but the way we acquired it. This is a typical situation in our office of a team deliberating over a plan. This is a typical situation in the design circumstances of G-Star, the jeans brand. And if you overlay these, you almost get a kind of seamless connection between their way of working and our way of working. And it seems that the language of creativity now is the universal presence of the sweatshop in some form or other. This is another overlay where clothes morph into buildings. This is an advertisement of their clothes at the time. This is Seattle and CCTV, and this is a kind of merger even between the raw details of the denim and the raw details of the construction of our buildings. This is their manifesto, G-Star Raw, all about the product, blah, 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 G-Star denim. Whenever you replace the word G-Star by OMA and denim by architecture, actually their mission statement could have been our mission statement. This is an advertising, their advertising language, lots of black and white, actually a kind of sedated blue. A precursor of the building on a billboard actually at the site where the building was eventually realized, where even the language of the building was to some extent, I guess, affected by the language they used in their advertisement. Here from another angle, and here's the realized version, where the rain, I guess, is the predominant difference. The building by night, a kind of loop of service functions that show big boxes where the whole building is a kind of shop window of the creative process that goes on within the building used for advertisement, etc., etc. But the content of the process is actually the advertisement to the outside. What I guess one could compare this to is and what we do, I guess could be likened to a form of method acting. This is Lee Strasberg of the Actors Studio, where essentially you don't act, but you simply go through a period of extreme identification with your subject, with that which you have to act. When we worked on the G-Star building, we had a period of almost a year hanging out with them, seeing their process, studying their whole thing, until a moment that we almost kind of breathed their process. And this is, I think, increasingly what we do, where in a way our architectural projects are preceded by a period of, you could call, journalism or identification, where then the building that comes out of it is a different building than would come out of it if we wouldn't do that. Another big example, this is not one of Lee Strasberg's pupils. This is Miuccia Prada, the head of Prada, which I think is another client that we have a similar relationship with, a very long-standing collaboration where the whole notion of client-architect kind of almost fades into the background into a kind of partnership, where of course also a fashion brand is a kind of cultural patent, is a kind of aura machine. The Prada store we did in New York, which is essentially a shop, but of course it's a shop that is also an event space, very, very deliberately, that at times the whole layout of the shop caters for certain performances, and the kind of the events announce the presence of a brand. That relationship has progressed to the point where we're not only doing their buildings anymore, but we do their fashion shows, we do a part of their advertisement, we have worked with them on their website, and I think this was even a 1990s telephone that we designed with Prada. I'm showing this as the first kind of deliberate straying off the subject, with more to come. What we have found is that actually in the world of globalizations, corporations change so quickly that a building as an expression of their identity is almost by definition problematic. It takes 5 years, sometimes 8 years to design a building. Takeovers, mergers, rebranding of company goes at a much more speedy rhythm. This is an example, what we found when we worked on the building for Universal Studios, also a commission in the late 90s. They approached us for a building. They actually wanted to house a set of activities. They approached us for a building But I guess that building was nothing other than a statement of how to express a merger between a music business, a media company, and a liquor company. So that building was never realized. This was in a way our conclusion at the end, where this is architecture, and I guess this is the kind of architecture that, between quotation marks, that it really was, a kind of form of solidifying a merger and a search for identity of an essentially seamless or fluid corporation. As I said, that building did not get built. Actually, the vast majority of what we do doesn't get built. I think there's about 25% that does, and I think even that is optimistic. But that is a very interesting phenomenon. I think this building, in the end, we elaborated it all the way to tender drawings when actually the client decided to cancel the whole project. So it was an investment of years that actually went up in smoke and joined the ranks of projects that never got built. 75% of our energy is dedicated to the virtual by the mere fact that the real doesn't always materialize. It's a very interesting situation. If architecture once had the authority to make blueprints, this is Corbusier Plan Voisin for Paris in 1925, it never got implemented. This is Mumbai, and the interesting thing about this picture, it's a plan for the modernization of Mumbai. The interesting thing about this picture is that it's not designed by an architect, it's designed by McKinsey. It's the cover of a McKinsey report on the future of Mumbai. And strangely enough, with a little bit of an evil twist, one could say that it's not that dissimilar. It caters to, I guess, a certain need for variety, but essentially it's high-rises and all the inventions of modern architecture and the modern projects actually resurface without an apparent need for architects anymore. Modern architecture, in a way, triumphs at a moment that all the teachings of modern architecture are categorically rejected by the world at large. At the same time, architecture resurfaces in the most perverse and strange sort of ways. Architecture has become almost a metaphor of anything charged with a certain amount of intent. The architects of warfare, the architects of science, I think that that's one is even eyelash architecture. But there is an interesting situation of full cycle also here. All these words refer to architecture or refer to elements of all architecture, but invariably almost each of these words in the current discourse is more known for its metaphorical meaning than it is known for its literal meaning. And you can on the one hand interpret it as the definite dissolution of architecture. You can also, on a more positive note, interpret it as a strange revenge of architecture's conceptual relevance when its final products may not necessarily enjoy great status. So there's architecture and there is architecture. Clearly, we have a vehicle that did and continues to involve itself with architecture. But by and large, AMO was a parallel vehicle which set itself a goal from the late 90s onwards to capture everything that is architecture without being physical. So if OMA is a real doing act building, AMO's virtual thinking reflect non-building, some of the states of mind that are often not in high regard within the action-oriented architectural profession, to introduce a level of contemplation as an economically viable part of our business. So then this was the definition. While OMA remains delegated, it goes beyond business, architectural thinking in its pure form. It had a very interesting effect. First of all, it extended the range of clients, but it also, more importantly, made sure that we from then on had a very different relations with clients, where we're not the passive recipients of a question, but where we could sort of engage with clients in a partnership and thereby also expand our domain of knowledge in whatever these clients were supposed specialists in. So the whole distinction between practicing and learning, designing and researching actually faded the moment that was. So this is a kind of diagram that shows domains of expertise and respective clients and a kind of galaxy of almost random knowledge acquired through doing commissions. I would like to show a few projects that fall under the NOMA of AMO. It's a small selection, but I think an interesting selection because none of them have to do with building per se. One project was a project for the European Union. It actually initially came to the office as a fairly traditional architectural request. It was to think about Brussels, which at that point in time, 2001, had been given the title Official Capital of the European Union. Now, the European Union is not a country. Therefore, Brussels is not the capital of a country, but the capital of a transnational political system, which was presumed to have very different symbolical needs than a national capital. Well, the symbolic needs you can see here. The expression is primarily kind of beige marble, brown smoke mirror glass, largely also built without the involvement of architects by mostly Belgian corrupt contractors. Its art is kind of sexless virgins wielding triumphantly euro signs. The nameplates on the door are characterized by an enormous redundancy that something very obvious has to be notified in any number of languages. Its portrait is, man in grey bat suits and dark ties with the occasional token women. At that moment, the whole system was in a state of expansion with more and more members. So you can this iconography of accumulation would then simply find itself. And the nameplate would essentially, into Cyrillic script, also wander off the page. So before addressing the symbolic deficit of Brussels as a capital, we decided to take the argument a little bit further and address the symbolic deficit, the iconographic deficit of what was called the European Union. A very efficient, benign, but hugely unpopular political system until this day. This is something we made in the context of that project. This is a book of 90,000 pages, 6.5 meters long, and it's all the regulations that countries have to comply to if they want to become a member. So it's both daunting and impressive. I mean, I guess it means a lot of hard work. A kind of lyrical monument to bureaucracy. Of course, this book doesn't exist. It only exists as separate files on the internet that we decided to print and bind. The acquis communautaire. The flag is a similar story. This is the European flag, but also the flag, rather than an emotional expression, is actually the product of bureaucracy, where in great detail the size of the stars, the color of the yellow, the radius of the circle is prescribed in an endless set of rules. So just imagine. This was, I guess, an emotional moment that signified, America's triumph over the world expressed on the moon. Evidence of, how well advanced America technologically was, the pride of the nation, blah, 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 blah. It's all in this image. But the flag isn't simply limited to expressions of national pride. It can also be a very populist symbol in the case of America. Now imagine that for Europe. This is the only advert that I could find which sort of matches that. And it's somehow... Europe cannot be sexy without making the point just a little bit too overtly. And I guess in many ways it's symbolic for what they suffer. We, in studying all of this, went back. We went back to the point that the European Union didn't exist yet. This was a competition for the German Marshall Fund in 1948, actually won by a Dutchman. A competition with the question that in a single poster be expressed the idea of a new European spirit after the war. And the beauty of this image is that Europe is nothing but the ship which is propelled by the sails which have the flags of the individual country that are all like-minded and want to propel the ship forward without ever being at the expense of the national identity, because they're all present, they're all equal. Well, this is what is left of that symbol in the average European Union building lobby, a kind of series of dead fish where definitely the energy has been deflated, but nevertheless something that we thought was a potentially interesting source of an experiment. We looked at all the flags. We had, I think, 15 members at the time. We went from west to east, from Ireland to Greece at the tail end, progressively abstracted these flags into a new symbol, which somehow does everything Europe professes to do. It is diverse. It is colorful. It expresses actually every single nation in some way or other. But at the same time, rather than the signpost in front of the buildings with the names, it can be perceived immediately. So it has a degree of immediacy, but can survive the short attention span of the modern media. At the same time, it has a degree of variety, which Europe so emphatically says it has, but never shows. So how does that work? This is our spokesman. Speaking in front of a beige wall. I think behind his head is a socket. Whatever he would have to say would be infinitely more interesting if he spoke in front of a European barcode. It's also a flag that the more members join, and I think the Ukraine is part of this, only becomes more beautiful. So on the question of whether or not Europe should expand, the answer is simply yes, because the flag gets more beautiful. Now, this was an experiment in the context of an exercise that was deemed to think about the symbolic needs of Brussels, but things got out of hand rather seriously. We got a call, I think, on a late Friday in the office from an English tabloid journalist asking whether we had designed a new flag, which we emphatically denied because we had just made a new symbol. After asking the question 5 times and saying no 5 times, he hung up the phone, but shortly before concluding, he said, "So it's a flag." The next day, on the cover of The Independent, the story had been sold on. The flag came in, goodbye stars, Heddlestra, new symbol of the EU. Chief Commissioner of the EU has seen the flags, likes it, approval pending, old flag on its way to extinction. So then England, the country most notoriously against the EU, spontaneously fell in love with the old flag, simply because they like tradition, I guess. And the next morning, other British newspapers launched the idea of a competition under the title New European Flag, Can You Do Better? Another example of what happened and what spiraled is that in 2006, I believe, Austria became president of the European Union, actually adopted it as an official symbol, extended the Austrian flag a little bit to stand. It's Austria of all countries, but anyway, extend the flag, and it became a symbol where it simply became unwittingly the background of an enormous political arena. That's which had actually started as a relatively light-hearted exercise on a perceived problem. There you go. He came, I think, in that same year, and without ever having realized it, indicated that the power of Europe should be bigger, and he presumably, it looks like he also liked the bigger flag. The same time, when the EU was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, I think it was a couple of years ago, again, the flag was dusted off in much of the Dutch press as a symbol to represent that occasion. The reason why I'm showing this is that the strange thing in many of the AMO work is that what often starts as a light-hearted expression of a perceived problem and a twist on things generates an enormous amount of media attention. We have a situation in the office where maybe 5% of the staff and turnover is AMO work, but about 40% of all media attention goes out to precisely those projects, which I think is indicative of something, at least. This went on. This is, again, in Brussels. This is the epicenter of symbolic urban presence of the European Union. It's essentially a roundabout. On that roundabout, for the Dutch presidency, a couple of years after, we made a design of a circus tent that was an exhibition about Europe. The circus tent has the colors of the flag in one of the monumental axes of the city. And essentially, this project is a kind of panoramic exhibition of Europe's history. Here again you see the long book, a light bulb with the global news projected on it, and a table where actually the leaders of Europe can meet. So a circus tent as a supposed meeting place of the leaders of Europe in a context of European history as decorum. The opening, and actually, funnily enough, on the day of the opening, there was an Iranian demonstration outside the tent against Europe, etc., for which, in a way, the tent was a nice backdrop in terms of the political liveliness that entered the area. On the heels of this, we've done more work. A later request by a European lobby organization to our office was to help think in a larger team about an energy infrastructure for Europe. An energy infrastructure which, as its central purpose, had the idea to reduce the role of oil and gas in favor of more durable, sustainable sources of energy. A hot topic, I guess, as it is anywhere, but of course typically in Europe, a topic that is practiced in an extreme state of division, where I think Germany is planting solar plants, Sicily is building wind farms where there's essentially no wind, but everybody does anything, and there's a very small degree of coordination. In typical fashion, it's pursued individually, and the premise of our project was to study the theoretical gains in terms of energy if Europe would act in a coordinated and integrated manner. That you would get wind energy where there was wind, you would get solar energy where there was sun, but through an interconnection of the system, both benefited from each other. And the key problem with renewable energy sources is their volatility. There isn't always sun, but when there isn't sun, there's presumably wind. When there isn't wind, there's presumably sun. So by an interlinking of, in a way, different through an energy network of different sources of renewable energy, a kind of a Europe-wide robust system of energy sources was generated with wind energy, geothermal, hydro, biomass, to the point that actually Europe could be reinterpreted as a tapestry of different renewable energy sources, which could all be linked in a kind of mutually reinforcing network. The calling card for this project, pretty much along the lines of the barcode flag, was actually a map of Europe where the nations, the individual nation states, are abandoned in favor of energy regions that carry the name of the predominant source of energy. A carbon capture storage republic which again had a phenomenal effect on the exercise, where we were only in a way a small part of a conglomerate of companies where actually technical companies, of course, played a much more interesting and important role than ourselves. Nevertheless, the whole image of the project has and is being this image also in the European press. The theoretical effect of a network like that is actually that when all these sources are added together, the amount of terawatt hours generated by it actually surpass the amount of terawatt hours of the combined oil and gas reserves of the entire Middle East. So in doing this, it's not just a technocratical question, it's an extremely important geopolitical issue. Later on, carried out another thing on a global level for the WWF, but it's a very important political issue because Europe, and it's very actual at the moment, Europe, an emphatically democratic continent for its energy supply, is dependent on regions with a considerably smaller commitment to democracy than Europe itself. I mean, we're going through the Ukrainian situation at the moment, which is a very evident dilemma. North Africa, the Middle East, etc., etc., etc. Well, kind of the image speaks for itself. We did, on the heels of our energy work, actually a study for renewable energy in Russia. Russia is the king of oil and gas. It's the prime source of its power at the moment. But the question remains whether in the long run that is in the interest of anybody, but also whether that is in the interests of Russia. Also their energy reserves are being depleted. They have to go to much more difficult and often naturally protected reserves to get oil. They have to go to ever greater length to drill for oil and gas. This is actually a kind of very prominent nature reserve of wetlands with a Luke oil platform right in the middle of it. Of course, Russia is an incredibly large country where most of the people actually live on a relatively small part of its territory, which internally creates a very strange situation. It has a very distorted energy balance. Siberia, where most of the energy is found, is remote from the populous regions. So where energy is produced is far away from where energy is used, to the point that inside Russia, actually energy travels much longer distances than it does in some cases when one country exports it to another. The energy loss that is lost in the transport over long distances is phenomenal. This is a very typical, coupled to the state of neglect of some of the pipelines and transport systems, creates a kind of an outrageous, phenomenally ineffective situation. 25% or 10 million Russians currently are not connected to the grid at all. That is either in remote locations or it is actually in dacha settlements all throughout the country, which are supposedly holiday homes, but in today's Russia they're actually most of all suburban, properly inhabited homes. So somehow they themselves there are compelling arguments to say that the insistence on oil and gas is not in the long-term interest of Russia itself. So we investigated kind of more here, not a network, as we did in the case of Europe, but we investigated the possibility of local renewable energy production, which would actually cater, first and foremost, to the areas currently not on the grid and deprived of energy. And by doing that, in a way creating a foothold in terms of the acceptance of that sort of energy, which in the long run might lead to a much larger transformation. This is, anyway, our Russian propaganda about renewable energy. We wrote a book about that stuff, Beyond Oil and Gas, Exploring Russia's Energy Future. And that brings me on to the next subject. The last project I showed, the energy project, was produced in the context actually of another project. This is the project for a Russian school, where we do not design the school as a building, but where we design the curriculum and in a way the program of a postgraduate school. A school funded by media oligarchs, a school not dedicated to any subject in particular. It has as its mission to think about issues which may be relevant for the Russia of the future. The school is supposed to be a breeding ground of future visionaries. Here you see one of the future visionaries. Very emphatic statements, almost like Lutheran statements on the church at the entrance of the school, with various degrees of meaninglessness, but clearly still a very admirable effort, at least to found a postgraduate school not dedicated to any professional skill, but simply dedicated to thinking about the future of a nation. The last project we did in that school, in that context, was actually analyze the nature of prediction. It's a project called Foresight in Hindsight. It analyzes predictions, but it analyzes prediction of the past, using the present as a track record of what came of those predictions. Now, the interesting thing about predictions is that everybody makes them. And it's a shared domain of almost all professional or even non-professional fields. It is both the domain of mysticism, as in the case of the fortune teller, but it's also the domain of science. It's actually where mysticism and science, in a weird way, converge, and only the future will tell who's right. But the scientist and the fortune teller have got one thing in common, and that's they both get it wrong. This is a prediction presumably made by religious fanatics on Judgment Day, one that has to continuously be adjusted. presumably fools, but I mean, there is also a more serious dimension. This is another example, the Y2K issue, where the combined American intelligence and defense system was mobilized to avert a disaster that essentially never happened. Let's take a look at predictions. The phone has too many flaws to be seriously considered as a means of communication. Western Union. Clearly they had a vested interest in saying that. Television won't last because people will soon get tired of staring at a plywood box every night. 20th Century Fox. Clearly an industry that also had a vested interest in saying that. We do not like their sound, and guitar music is on the way out of fashion. The Grandpa recording studio that refused to sign up the Beatles. There is no reason why someone would want a computer in it. Why would they? But this is very interesting. I mean, these are predictions that are all wrong. At the same time, there are predictions which are eerily close. This is from Stanley Kubrick's Space Odyssey, the Newspad. We presumably all now recognize this thing as the iPad. Fiction writer Jules Verne, very interesting. A book written in the 19th century speculating on the nature of 20th century Paris. By 1960, mindless attention to finance and science will have turned most women into cynical, ugly, neurotic career women. Another statement from that book. A geometric modern centerpiece will be built in front of the Louvre Museum in Paris, and that is freaky. That is very, very freaky. It's actually a fiction writer that is dead on. This intrigued us, and as a student project, we spent most of our time building a kind of database, a website, a kind of Wikipedia of past prediction. What was the future of? And we analyzed literally thousands and thousands and thousands of prediction. Anything, let's say, from the return of Christ to the bankruptcy of Freddie Mac, from the end of the world to the future of dishwashers, and categorize this heterogeneous mix according to subject and according to source. And here, a very interesting pattern starts to emerge. Supposedly, each source should have a very monomatic relationship with the subject that it claims. But if you analyze predictions, you find that that is hardly the case. That it's also the ultimate domain of promiscuity, where essentially the one domain where everybody claims the liberty to predict about everything. So in a way, the next step, what we did is we built a matrix that in a way allowed us to record that diversity, where the 5 subjects and the 5 sources are matched, where essentially our 100,000 predictions were spread and categorized on according to what they were about and who made them. And then we started a kind of true or false analysis in the hope to discover patterns. The whole website has a kind of standard form to standardize predictions according to when they were made, when they were expected, etc., etc. So here is a number. I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers. The chairman of IBM, clearly wrong. One day we will have a computer atlas in every home hooked up to an enormous library so you can ask any question and be given an answer. Isaac Asimov, a fiction writer, not a computer man who was essentially right. But often it's more complex than that. Horse-drawn coaches will be used in a tunnel under the English Channel. Now, the tunnel's there, but to my knowledge, horse-drawn coaches have never used it. Another one, the world, then there is a category of the permanently adjusted predictions. The world will end before 4000 AD. It will end in 1186, it will end nuclear holocaust, and then another nuclear holocaust by 2003. Jesus will return in 500 AD. Probably a few times after that as well. And this is very interesting because this is clearly the domain of religion. But in a weird way, it actually reminds me of predictions of when actually the Greek economy will recover. It's a similarly perpetually adjusted assessment. And here it actually pertains to the realm of the economy. Let's look at the economy in our matrix. What turns out to be, predictions are mostly wrong, but it actually turns out that actually profits make the most accurate predictions about the economy. Let's look at another track record. The political, simply always wrong. And then a kind of taking stock of the thing as a whole. One would expect the green to be distributed like that people make accurate predictions when they're talking about something they supposedly know about. The actual real pattern we found in our method is actually more like this. It's a sort of, well, with a little bit of goodwill, a diagonal that runs in the other direction, which, strangely enough, indicates that in terms of track record, the most accurate prediction comes from the least expected sources, which I think is a very beautiful argument for multidisciplinarity, a very beautiful argument in a weird way also for professional excursions into other domains, et cetera, and to take unexpected sources very seriously, and maybe even the fortune teller herself. Thank you very much. I think we have time for questions. Tough.
Do you think that AMO could have existed or
Speak into the microphone. Yeah.
Maybe the microphone.
Do you think that AMO's work could have existed under the auspice of OMA without creating the secondary branch or without physically separating the infrastructure of that office?
I think to some extent the work of AMO existed before we started to call it that. So in that sense, the answer is yes. But I think had we not made it an independent entity, which to some extent also was charged with an obligation to economically fund that kind of thinking, it wouldn't have taken the flight it has. I mean, one of the interesting things about AMO is that it's a kind of also a business model where you can actually be paid for your hobbies rather than having to exercise your hobbies on the number of what gets you paid. So,
if you don't mind me asking a second question. I'm curious what this might mean for architecture practices in particular in their old manner of organization, whether this means that architecture offices become something else or if they all have separate offices for their hobbies.
I don't know, but I mean the thing I always struggle is that people look for recommendations when I talk. I mean there simply are none. This is what we do, this is what we show, and I don't for a minute think that this is the way to go for every single architectural practice in the world. What I think it does do, it offers a menu. It offers a menu to extend your reach, change your reach, or stay the same, actually become more traditional if you want it. It just doesn't preclude that choice. So all that it tries to do is insert a notion of a kind of intellectual generosity in a profession which is often very hermetic and very serious about itself. But I mean, people can almost take whatever from this and pursue it or simply continue to pursue buildings. I think it's an interesting metaphorical diverse range of what architecture could be. And we as an office have chosen to pursue as wide a range as possible, but I don't think that's a moral imperative by any means.
I think I have a question about non-metropolitan architecture. You kind of took us through a universal kind of international image of the world. So from the EU to Russia, let's say. And I want to know, what I'm interested in is there's there's locations where resistance is inherent to a landscape, let's say, or in relation to topography. And I'm curious if you feel that if a non-metropolitan condition exists, or what it might be, or how AMO or OMA would operate in such a condition.
Well, I think certainly a non-metropolitan condition exists, because almost by definition, every condition by default creates its antithesis. You know, if there is a metropolitan condition, there is a non-metropolitan condition, because if clearly more than half of humanity, and in the future maybe more, flocks to the cities, there's an enormous reservoir left in the wake of that journey. So the kind of the exacerbated countryside exists by virtue of the exacerbated metropolis, and that is in any way a condition that you find, is that modernization or progress always has a flip side and an added responsibility to cater to that flip side. The flip side of modernization is that modernization puts on the agenda the notion of preservation, because simply the existing stock of buildings becomes under threat when modernization is too rapidly. Fascination for the metropolis and the triumph of the metropolis in its wake generates an urgency to think about the countryside, etc. A disappearance of the public sector in politics actually creates an enormous necessity to think about what is public space in the context of a private economy. So I think by definition the answer to your question is yes.
I guess I'd like to discuss kind of a little bit about infrastructure and the need for infrastructure for a building the size of, say, Rotterdam, because you talked about the speed of the merger and chasing that. So I'm wondering if you could walk us through a little bit your process on a building of that size, whether it's transportation or whether what was involved with that. And I guess I'm always a little confused with OMA. You mentioned the iconograph of accumulation, and it's an office that's critical of that, but it's an office that seems to also depend on that for buildings of size. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could tie that in as well, and if you have an idea about, say, a sweet spot for density, say, like, in Japan, you were just talking about the countryside and, the emerging metropolis versus something like high-density, low-rise buildings in Japan, and I guess maybe discuss the infrastructure allocation.
I think that's probably 4 or 5 questions in one. But let me sort of take a bit. I mean, our office is very deliberately a universe of moral contradictions. Yeah, because I mean, the Renaissance is an onslaught of a present state of architecture to which we have happily contributed, if not ignited it to some form. So there is the perpetual, almost like the second part of Wittgenstein's oeuvre is a denouncement of the first. There are these cycles, and I think often people inquire about that. I mean, the moral contradictions in our work, making it very hard to make out where we stand. I think for us this is a very integral part of our office. I think consistency is overrated. Anyway. The thing also is, and I think it's partially inevitable, because architecture is not a force of its own. Architecture, by definition, exists by the fact that people ask architect to execute things. And the whole dilemma of an architect is that its reputation, its aura, generates an expectation of a coherent body of work, when actually the real course of his career is a series of separate loyalties it has to cultivate over and over and over again towards different clients. So I think contradiction in that sense in any body of work is inevitable. You can conceal it, and we've in a way decided to celebrate it, not even hide it. The Rotterdam was an extremely, that big building was an extremely slow process. I think building got into the office in 1998 and was finally completed last year. It took a period of 15 years. It was put on hold for various reasons at various times. But the interesting thing there is that, and the building changed significantly, but to the superficial eye, there was almost no change, because it was a building that worked with a kind of seemingly accidental composition of blocks, which we knew would be able to accommodate changes without actually compromising the overall aesthetic appearance, because it was deliberately not engineered on a kind of aesthetic perfection. It's also the largest building we did in the Netherlands, and presumably also the last of its kind in the Netherlands, because I mean it's the product of an economic upturn at the end of the 90s that was designed in such a way that you couldn't phase it very deliberately, so it would either go on hold or it would happen or it would not happen. And in the end, so that's what it did. It looked like it happened, it didn't happen, but in the end it's there. Which
any more questions?
Yeah, one more.
How did you get to where you were, and how can I get there?
Sorry?
Said, how did you get to be where you are today, and how could I get there?
That's a very good question. How long do we have? I don't consider myself in any way very accomplished, if that's the underlying tenor of your question. I mean, I consider my career progression a fairly normal career progression that has taken a long time. And also, I have to say, in the context of the office, considerations like that are not very much at the forefront. I mean, our office is a place to work. I think the nice thing is that it's also a place to learn, and that learning and working are not that distinctive. So if that's a source of enjoyment or joy long enough, I think that there is a sort of logical career progression anyway. I was 31 years when I came. I am 50 this summer. I just see my life as the sort of progression of a regular guy. So there's hope, I guess.
I'm curious about how, I think most of architecture students is curious about this, but how do you, being creative at the same time, and you deal with the regulations? For example, a critique of the CCTV project will be the corridor is too long to reach the vertical circulation from the center of the platform where the two angle meets. Or in the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, the platform is like 50 meters high, and if there's a fire broke up in the higher floor, the truck or the firefighter can't reach there. But how do you deal with this kind of critiques when you're trying to doing like very creative buildings? Thank you.
Well, you certainly study them well. We have the same. I mean, I guess it's vaguely related to the last question. Is that we have the same fire regulations, the same building code issues, and no matter how famous any architectural office gets, those are the rules that apply, those are the rules that apply to us, and those are the rules that we take into account.
Anyone else? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yay! Yay!